So welcome everyone to our first afternoon session today. There are still people joining, but while people are coming in, we'll get started with introductions. So this is our first afternoon session for day 3 of the Reimagining Climate Adaptation Summit. Our day's theme has been Imagining Thriving Futures, and our first session this afternoon is Adaptation at Scale. And my name's Associate Professor Louise Crabtree-Hayes. I'm a Principal Research Fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney Uni. And we, with Future Earth Australia and the Sydney Environment Institute at University of Sydney, are co-hosting this summit, which has seen some incredibly productive and generative conversations, which I'm sure this session will continue to contribute to. So firstly, I'd just like to quickly acknowledge that I'm on Barramadagal country today, here on the banks of the Parramatta River. And I'd just like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the knowledge and wisdom that has kept country thriving for millennia and continues to do so today. So I'll introduce our speakers all to start off, and then as with our other sessions, there will be 10 minutes per speaker, and then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes of facilitated discussion amongst the panel, and then 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A. And as you can see in the chat there, there's an invitation to put your questions in during the presentations. So firstly, our first speaker is Jo Morrison, and you can see our speakers on screen. Jo's the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation. He's a highly respected and trusted Indigenous leader from Katherine in the Northern Territory, who has both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage. He has a BA in Land Management from the University of Sydney and an honorary doctorate from the University of New South Wales for his contribution to Indigenous land and sea management, policy development and advocacy. Mr. Morrison has 30 years experience working in Northern Australia with the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, governments, industry, land councils and the Northern Australia Indigenous Reference Group. He's been deeply involved in the areas of Indigenous ranges, carbon farming, climate change, economic development, research and policy, water, land rights and native titles. So thank you so much, Jo, for joining us today. After Jo will be Scott Hickman. Scott Hickman is a grazier on Oatley, an 800-hectare property in Canowindra in central west New South Wales. His property is managed under holistic management principles with a focus on building resilience into our landscapes, businesses and people. He's also a project manager for Mid-Lachlan Landcare's Growing the Grazing Revolution, which has been running for the past 12 years. This project focuses on helping locals to connect, share knowledge and mentor each other, in turn helping them achieve positive outcomes and ensuring the resilience of whole communities. Scott has also been a facilitator for Upper Lachlan Landcare, Burrawa Community Landcare Group and Condobolin District Landcare, helping other areas achieve similar goals. So our third speaker will be David Tucker. He's the Chief of Infrastructure Assessment at Infrastructure Australia, with responsibility for providing best practice, fit for purpose guidance on the preparation and evaluation of infrastructure proposals. He's currently tasked with a major refresh of the Infrastructure Australia assessment framework to ensure that it is pragmatic while remaining robust and clearly defines how proposals are assessed for inclusion on the infrastructure priority list. David joined Infrastructure Australia in 2018 after over 16 years with some of Australia's top tier consulting firms. His technical experience includes planning, design and evaluation across multiple industry sectors and covering each stage of the project lifecycle. He is a proficient project manager on multidisciplinary projects and has strong skills in portfolio and program governance. He's also been providing leadership in a culture change program at Infrastructure Australia and is a member of the Reconciliation Action Plan working group and is active in collaborations with stakeholders from across the country. And our last speaker, but not least, will be Professor Petra. Oh, I've not pronounced your surname before. Tschakert. Sorry if that's a horrible mangling of your name. is Centenary Professor in Rural Development in the Development of Geography and Planning, School of Social Sciences at the University of Western Australia. Her research activities and practice focus broadly on human-environment interactions and more specifically on rural livelihoods, environmental and climate change, adaptation, resilience, marginalisation, loss, climate justice, social learning and deliberate societal transformation. She was coordinating lead author of Chapter 5, which is Sustainable Development, Poverty Eradication and Reducing Inequalities of the Special Report on 1.5 degree global warming of the IPCC. Previously, she was coordinating lead author on the IPCC's 5th assessment report on Chapter 13, which is Livelihoods and Poverty of the Working Group 2 report on Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, and was part of the core writing team of AR5 synthesis report. So as you can see, we've got quite an extraordinary and formidable panel with us today, and I'm sure we're going to have a fantastic series of presentations and then conversations about adaptation at scale. So I will now hand the microphone over virtually to you, Jo. Thank you. Jo, you'll need to unmute. There you are.
Thanks, Anne. Welcome, everyone. As mentioned, I come from two sets of Indigenous heritage here in Australia, Dargaman in the Northern Territory and Mwalgal in the Torres Straits. But I'm calling in from the lands of the Wadawurrung in Victoria. So acknowledging traditional owners for all of those places where people are connected into the webinar today. Firstly, I'd like to start really talking about the Indigenous estate here in Australia. And we know globally that Indigenous systems of law recognise that Indigenous peoples hold rights over more than a quarter of the global landmass at a global level. These holdings account for at least 38 million square kilometres over 87 countries and intersect with about 40% of protected areas and intact landscapes around the world. And there's growing acknowledgement by governments and large environmental groups that the places where Indigenous people live are where the majority of the world's biodiversity, linguistic and cultural diversity occur, and also where major carbon stocks, intact freshwater and marine expanses occur. It's also a place where many climate solutions are being generated and put into place. But clearly the role of Indigenous people and the future of the planet's climate are entwined the world over. And here in Australia, as you can see from the map, the return of country to Indigenous people has been a long and often painful journey that remains ongoing for many Indigenous people and groups. To date, it has delivered a patchwork of recognised rights, interests and tenures, characterised as the Indigenous estate growing in size and covering over 50% of the Australian landmass. Climate change is impacting Indigenous people in our country on a daily basis. People are reporting changes as a result of climate change, such as mangrove dieback, notable changes in seasons and shifting of plants and animals occurring, sea level rises, coral reefs bleaching, and impacts on wildlife populations and the availability of bush foods. Indigenous people in both remote and urban settings are relatively vulnerable to climate change impacts, both in terms of high rates of chronic illness, limited personal financial resources and low quality and often overcrowded housing and poor infrastructure. We are disproportionately affected by already low socioeconomic circumstances. And even though the majority of Indigenous people reside in urban settings at almost 80%, we comprise a large proportion of the remote Australian population, where we are more likely to live in remote communities and outstations, where the above issues are compounded by a general lack of services and infrastructure. Climate change represents a threat to cultural and physical Indigenous heritage. For example, in places such as the Torres Straits and other coastal communities where sea level rises have been damaging heritage places, ancient burial sites, for example, is an ongoing concern. The extensive and unprecedented fires on the East Coast last summer, considered by many to be consistent with climate change expectations, will no doubt have harmed or destroyed thousands of culturally important places. And in the built environment, relative economic disadvantage exacerbates climate change and constrains individual and community agency to leverage the inherent adaptive strengths of Indigenous communities. Slide 2, please. Ensuring and growing Indigenous rights over country are recognised as a global strategy to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. In addition to leveraging the rights over country and proximity to impacted landscape of Indigenous people, the adaptation effort can also be enhanced by fully engaging the adaptive capacity of Indigenous people and communities, utilising ancient Indigenous knowledge, practices and insights into living in a sustainable way here in Australia and elsewhere. Ensuring and growing Indigenous rights over country are recognised as a global strategy to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. To scale adaptation in the Australian context, we need to bring these strategies to reality, moving to inclusion and prioritisation of Indigenous knowledges and perspectives. It is understood that Indigenous people living on country and using ancient wisdom and traditional knowledge are well placed to notice the impacts of changing climate. More effort is required to support Indigenous communities to understand climate change risk and to develop culturally informed adaptations and innovative responses to their communities and countries. Indigenous participants at the recent First Nations Peoples Gathering on Climate Change in Cairns voiced the desire for their knowledge about land and sea country, caring for country and climate to be considered on an equal footing with non-Indigenous community and scientific approaches. Broadly, there is a call from Indigenous people for a respectful two-way dialogue about climate change to establish the groundwork for collaboration. Proactive and enabling policies and programs from all levels of government, scientists and service providers are required. Policies and practice must empower Indigenous people both as individuals and collectives to bring their culture, language and skills to the table in tackling national, regional and climate change issues. This means listening to and financially supporting the aspirations and ideas of Indigenous people with regard to climate change. For example, fully resourcing and empowering Indigenous rangers in management of vast swathes of Australia's remote landmass, including such matters as feral animal and weed control and firefighting, could increase biocultural diversity, improve human health and well-being and create lasting and relevant employment. The outcomes would be increasing carbon outcomes as well as developing resilience in the human population. Not only do these activities facilitate Indigenous people in harnessing the potential of the Indigenous estate or to generate income, employment and career development, but the projects also contribute to the restoration of culture and ecological balance and enable Indigenous people to be leaders in Australia's efforts to tackle global challenges around climate change. It is therefore important that Indigenous people and perspectives are given the appropriate priority and agency to develop and implement solutions to climate change, both in terms of land and sea management, but also in terms of Australia's national response to the global challenge. Slide 3, please. Indigenous people are relatively vulnerable to climate change impacts and are capable partners in creating and delivering adaptation and mitigation activities. We seek respect and recognition for our knowledge about lands and climate, with our affinity with country and our right to participate in these conversations on a level pegging with scientists and other representatives of the broader community. Indigenous knowledge offers a profound depth of understanding and intimacy with the Australian environment. For example, well-documented oral traditions from around Australia include intergenerational knowledge transfer that describe the sea level rise that scientists tell us accompanied the end of the last ice age around 13,000 years ago. During the return of Indigenous-led land management across the tropical savannas of Northern Australia, scientists and Indigenous people realised that traditional fire practices dramatically reduced greenhouse gas emissions that would otherwise have resulted from uncontrolled wildfires caused by depopulating landscapes. The Savannah Fire Abatement Methodology and Ranger Development, led by the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, and then with the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, now provides a land management income for Indigenous fire practitioners who are resuming traditional fire management activities informed by modern science and technology across 18 million hectares of the North. The result so far is an estimated 6 million tonnes of abatement since 2012, with abatement numbers increasing year on year. It can be expected that the reintroduction of Indigenous land management approaches across other regions of Australia could deliver increased adaptive capacity and resilience across the Australian landscape, plus the potential for increased carbon storage and the associated financial prospects in the face of climate change. This is now being transferred to other parts of the world. The reports of the recent Royal Commission into Natural Disaster Arrangements, which stated an increasing risk profile predicted in climate change modelling, recommendations that the wider community engage with and learn from Indigenous people about the application of traditional land management approaches across all regions of Australia. In closing, my message is that Indigenous people are disproportionately affected by climate change. So ensuring their agency in the development of national policy settings, research and practical solutions for the First Nations of this country, as it is in many other parts of the world, is of paramount importance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I think that's a really great starting point for us to start thinking about these questions of scale. And I think that issue of expanding those sorts of programs and practices across the continent is a very timely conversation for us to have. So we'll now hand over to Scott. And as I said before, just please put your Q&A, your questions into the Q&A box as the presentations are rolling. So Scott, over to you now.
Righto, we're right to go. Okay, hi everybody. My name's Scotty Hickman, and as you've heard, I'm a farmer at Canoundra, which is a little place in central western New South Wales. We run 800 hectares here. We use holistic management principles, or ecological outcome principles, if you like to call it that way, functions. And we use livestock, herding livestock, to improve and enhance our ecology. And we have a really big focus on trying to build resilience into our landscapes here as well. We converted over from a pretty industrialised model about 13 years ago. And we were having some pretty big problems with the way our landscape was being managed. So we had a big change in what we do about 13 years ago, realising that we're at the forefront coalface of climate change. And I think that probably on the eastern side of Australia, especially in the last 5 years, has seen a whole range of different events happening, which have been quite scary. We've had big dry periods, we've had bushfires, and we've had floods, and we've had a really mild season as well, which is sort of indicating that we're going to have to be quite adaptive. But also, I think the most important thing is that we're going to have to build some really big resilience into what we do here. I have some pretty big goals when I talk resilience. I like to use 4 pillars when we're talking resilience. Obviously, landscape and ecology health is a massive one. If we can get deeper, richer, healthier soils, we're on our way definitely to helping with resilience in a large scale. Keeping our soils covered is another one. I don't know, I got very frustrated seeing dust bowls happening here over 3 years. And we had dust on in the middle of winter, which is not a nice sight. That's our valuable topsoil heading off somewhere else where it's not remaining where it should be. Also, we use large herding animals to hit some of our landscape goals. And they're a valuable part, because when we talk about landscape goals, I want as much green growing material and grass and diversity as I possibly can in my landscape, because that builds resilience. It means that when we get rainfall events at certain times of the year or different climatic changes in condition, if I can have a green growing plant in my landscape, I'm so much better off, not only for my animals, but for the fact of even carbon cycling, nutrient cycling, photosynthesization, which is one of the most important things that we know that happens in landscapes. This process means that we can build healthier, deeper soils, and we can grow soils, and that's probably one of the most critical things that we need to think about in our landscape. We've got to store more water in our soils. If we can get our carbon cycling working, we can store a huge amount of water into our soils, which again is building resilience. For every 1% organic matter left in our soils, we know we can store somewhere around about 160,000 litres more water per hectare. Now that's a valuable thing in a changing climate that we're experiencing. We're going to keep experiencing for a long while. Soil carbon is a vital one, and I can see that becoming a huge part of what agriculture is heading towards. Probably for future generations, it's going to be a massive one. But for us here at the moment, it means that we're increasing our soil health, and that is a vital one. We've managed to lift our soil carbon quite successfully. And it's important, as I say, that we are using the management of animals to do that. Probably a bit greatest ability with that is to actually stimulate fodder and grass to keep it in that growing phase. A ruminant animal is very good at also helping us open up a country that's gone a bit lignified as well. So that's an important part of what we do there as well. Again, it's important that we look at biodiversity as well. And I can see biodiversity becoming a major natural capital effect or trade well into the future, along with soil carbon. And I think it's one that's going to be growing hugely into the future. But also, if we've got diversity in our landscape of plants and animals above and below the ground, I'm talking with diversity, we're going to build huge amounts of resilience into our landscape. The other important one is being profitable as well. If I'm not profitable, I can't do what I'm doing here. And I think that's a very valuable one that we all have to think about. But it doesn't always necessarily mean cash as well. I think that when I just mentioned natural capital, soil carbon, but I think just for the health of our soil too, we've got to put a really big importance on how important that being profitable is in our landscape. And probably one of the most important things that we look at as well is the resilience of people. Farmers are really important, and there's a lot of good farmers doing a lot of good things. But we need to build resilience into those farmers as well to be able to use the latest technologies, the latest thoughts, latest observations, which I think probably are the really critical one. What is your land up to? How is it moving? Is it moving forward or is it moving backwards? How observations of when rainfall and things like that happen. What is actually happening with water in your landscape? What are you growing? How are your animals going? Are they healthy and happy? And it's a figure that I bring up to a lot of people is, and also human health. How important is that to people in rural communities? It's incredibly important. So the side of human being resilient is incredibly important. It's important that we also consider that a farmer is relied on 3 times a day, 7 days a week, 12 months of the year. So that's a big responsibility on our behalf as well. Not only to produce the best food and fibre the best way we can, but also to look after this wonderful land that we call Australia. And I'm very proud to be part of it, and I want to be part of it for many years to come. One of my big goals is to leave my land in better condition for future generations. And I think every single farmer should have that in their goals and their visions, because it is so important. We play an important role. We're not going to have all the answers, but we're going to have some of the answers and some of the solutions to be able to make adaptation and build resilience and help with this crisis of climate change. I just wanted to touch really quickly on what else I do. I'm also a facilitator with Mid-Lachlan Landcare on a grazing project called Grain the Grazing Revolution. I've been doing that for about 12 years now. It's an unusual thing for Landcare, probably in a lot of ways, that we concentrate on grazing management and landscape management. But when you consider that 85% of the landscape, especially around here, is under some form of grazing management throughout the year, I think it's a very important one. If we can get people to make 5 or 10% change a year in the way that they manage their livestock on landscapes with some principles, and I like to talk principles when I'm talking to people about this sort of thing, we can have a huge effect on large landscape outcomes, water, air, all the things that we want to improve, resilience of people as well. It's an interesting project. We have several grazing groups in the area that meet 3 to 4 times a year. We have peer leaders that we call peer leaders that help us out, encourage people, mentor people to make small improvements each time. And it's really important that when people do actually make a change, it is made, people can't be enforced to make a change, but when they do, it is wonderful that we can actually rely on that peer support and mentorship to be able to continue on with a positive change in landscapes and outcomes of landscapes and businesses too, which I think is really important. So Mid-Lachlan Landcare Growing the Grazing Revolution has been very successful. I couldn't do what I do without a lot of mentorship as well, and I think that's one that we all need, that mentorship and support, especially with some of the issues that we're going to have arising into the future. But I'm looking forward to many questions. I hope there's a heap of questions in what we've just spoken about there. So I'm just about done on that, but I'd like to thank everybody for listening.
Thanks so much, and I'm sure there will be questions. I can see them popping up already, so there will definitely be discussion coming on the back of this. So next in our session is David Tucker. So David, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you for the warm welcome today, and thank you for inviting me to take part. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waterways on which we're meeting, which for me here in Sydney is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, Infrastructure Australia advises governments, industry and the community on the investments and reforms needed to deliver better infrastructure for all Australians. So, sorry, Elise, if we wouldn't mind just dropping that slide for a moment, and I'll ask you when to bring it up. Thank you. So with our IA, we have 2 core functions. The first is to evaluate business cases for nationally significant infrastructure investments, and those seeking more than 250 million of Australian government funding. And the second is to set the agenda on the long-term opportunities for infrastructure reform that will support our future prosperity and quality of life. The resilience of our critical infrastructure is a key focus for us and a critical consideration of the advice we provide on those investments and reforms. So as we know, over 2019 and 2020, the resilience of our infrastructure has been tested on many fronts, and Australians have experienced unprecedented extremes, which have really emphasised the importance of our resilience to shocks and stresses. The bushfires, for example, damaged energy grids, which in turn disabled telecommunications infrastructure and water treatment facilities. Damaged transport and telecommunications infrastructure hindered emergency services coordination. And then, of course, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, which has challenged our healthcare system and the economy at large. And with the pandemic, people have shifted to living and working from home, and there's been a surge in cybersecurity threats, and telecommunications infrastructure has become more critical than ever. By 2050, the annual economic cost of natural disasters in Australia is expected to double from around $18 billion per annum at the moment to around $39 billion by that time. And in New South Wales, that's expected to triple from around 3.6 billion to around 10.6 billion over that same duration. So going forward, increasing frequency and severity of shocks and stresses, in part due to the effects of climate change, will test our collective capacity to cope as their cumulative impact becomes more likely to exceed our limits. So in my remarks today, I'll cover the role of infrastructure in building resilience and the reforms we recommend to support a more resilient future. Thanks, Elise, if you want to pop up that slide now. Thanks. So infrastructure has a critical role to play in supporting community resilience and with increasing uncertainty and evolving risk landscape, the role and function of infrastructure will need to change, as will the way infrastructure is planned, built, and operated. We need to move from risk to resilience planning. So while traditional planning, risk planning focuses on avoiding threats, resilience embraces these threats and acknowledges that they are unavoidable, shifting the focus to absorbing, managing, and recovering from disruption. To support this, a systemic approach to understand and quantify risk is necessary to ensure our assets, networks, systems, communities, and places are resilient. Assessments of risk and resilience should consider the multidimensional nature of challenges, including a comprehensive approach to shocks and stresses and future trends. The identification and communication of interconnections and interdependencies before, during, and after shocks or stresses is critical to manage systemic vulnerability. Thanks, Louise. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the infrastructure planning phase offers the most significant opportunity to plan for and achieve resilience. The decisions made at this stage establish the trajectory for the rest of the infrastructure lifecycle. It is the stage when important decisions like location, design, and management of asset interdependencies are made, beyond the resilience of the infrastructure asset itself. It is also when shared responsibility for outcomes can be built between government and the community. The planning phase is where whole of system and whole of place outcomes can be assessed, and when build and non-build options can be considered equally to find the most beneficial solution. Ensuring that resilience is considered at these early stages will improve project outcomes. And quantifying the potential impact of disasters and the benefits of strengthening our systems will build the economic case for investing in resilience in our infrastructure. We have identified 7 key characteristics to delivering resilience outcomes, and they're what's on your slide. They provide strategic direction around how to consider resilience in project development. Through our assessment framework, which is the body of knowledge we use for assessing major infrastructure proposals, we ask proponents to demonstrate how a proposal is affected by risks and opportunities brought on by climate and other shocks and stresses. Proposals should specifically consider how the infrastructure would continue to function under different future scenarios and how benefits would contribute to infrastructure and broader community resilience. Resilience considerations include physical climate risks, risks associated with the transition to a low carbon economy, community resilience to a broad range of the shocks and stresses that previously outlined, and then broader behavior and technology and other economic changes that can drive impact. This approach enables trade-offs to be acknowledged, whereby an element in the design has increased costs, but the benefits cannot be quantified, thereby negatively impacting the cost-benefit analysis of the proposals brought forward to us. Next slide, please, Louise. So building resilience requires place-based collaboration between infrastructure asset owners and operators, the community, and the Australian, state, territory, and local governments. In an environment of rapid change, uncertainty, and risk, it is critical we embed participatory engagement practices. Planning for and adapting to our future climate requires cross-societal and cross-sectoral effort, with coordinated buy-in and action needed across government, industry, and the community. Inclusive decision-making harnesses the knowledge communities have of their local places and the services they need in order to live productive, healthy lives. Digital technology also provides an opportunity to develop a deeper understanding of community needs and aspirations, and can provide a stronger evidence base to inform decision-making, project design, and delivery. Increasing the transparency around how infrastructure decisions are made will inform communities, build trust, and create the opportunity for feedback to be provided at a time and in a way that is most beneficial. Long-term coordinated planning processes that connect sectors, governments, businesses, and communities will ensure infrastructure works in the best interests of users and taxpayers. Picking up on Joe's comments from earlier, we also recognise the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders being heard through infrastructure development. In preparing for the future of our infrastructure, it's important that we learn from Indigenous peoples' unique history of land management and settlement, art, culture, and society that began over 60,000 years ago. Where appropriate, we encourage proponents to develop formal Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engagement strategy. This involves producing a specific plan to identify First Nations stakeholders, in addition to identifying potential impacts and leveraging any relevant insights. So in summary, climate change is already occurring, and the impacts will grow exponentially in future decades if we fail to act collectively. We need to be proactive rather than reactive. Without changes to how we plan infrastructure to better consider resilience, the benefits from existing and future investment will diminish in the face of increasing shocks and stresses. Achieving resilience requires a shift in focus from the resilience of the asset itself to the contribution of assets to the resilience of the system, or infrastructure for resilience. This approach requires consideration not only of strengthening the asset, network, and sector, but also of strengthening of the place, precinct, city, and region that the infrastructure operates within. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. And can I just do a quick check that my mic is picking up okay? Apparently my last mic was being a bit problematic. So if I can get a nod, if people can actually hear me speaking, excellent, that is good. Thank you. So last then, I will hand over to Petra to give the last of these short presentations, and then we'll bring it together for some discussion. So over to you, Petra.
Thank you very much, Louise. I'm delighted to be here. My focus is on place-based, embodied, and participatory approaches to adaptation, with examples from Western Australia. I'm speaking from unceded Whadjuk Noongar land, and I'm paying my respects to Noongar elders past and present. My starting point is what people value highly, and that's often not easy to measure in monetary terms, and how climate change puts these things at risk. Then we want to understand how people make trade-offs between the many things they value to protect what is most meaningful to them from the current and future climatic conditions. Now, such a values-driven place-based approach actually matches one of the core sections of the 2018 Profiling Australia's Vulnerability Report by the National Resilience Task Force that Mike Croswell led. Interestingly, it also matches one of the 6 guiding principles of the 2015 National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy, namely collaborative values-based choices. However, how to support such values-driven place-based adaptation in practice beyond the rhetoric is difficult, as we know. Here are 2 definitions that I think will help us with this task. I like to see adaptation defined as attempts to keep risks to valued objects or objectives at a tolerable level in the face of climate-related hazards. And limits to adaptation at the points at which adaptation fails to protect the things that people or stakeholders value. These are important because they focus on values. Now, drawing from a 4-year research project that we are conducting here in Western Australia, 8 communities from Perth to the Eastern Wheat Belt, rural and urban. Project is called Locating Loss from Climate Change in Everyday Places. And I'll give an example here of what that means for us. So 2 years into the project, we asked 80 plus or so of our participants to lay out the things they value on these small little gray cards that you see on the board. We have two axes, a horizontal axis on values, here to the right, what people value most, to the left, what is less valued, but still valued. The vertical axis on climate impacts from extreme, high to low and none. And so we asked people to position these value cards on the present climatic conditions, and these are the white magnets that you see, and indicating also the adaptation actions they undertake and the costs and side effects involved. And then position the value cards on the future climatic conditions that we explain best on the best projections that we have for these parts of Western Australia. And those that shift are then fixed with a blue magnet. And the blue magnets, as you can see, they're up there. So this allows for dynamic understanding of lift values and the relational understanding of harm. And these relationships, of course, are between people and places. So what do we see when we look at the data? We see, and that actually was a surprise, being mentally and emotionally healthy being one of the categories constantly and consistently up, and actually shifting up even more so in the future. These are the dark little dots, with anxious and worried being the most important and often mentioned emotional states, especially regarding bushfires and feeling trapped with relation to heat. But we also saw animals, plants and animals around us, and how their clustering is very up in the top right quadrant, which is highly valued and highly impacted. Often ending actually in the extreme space, meaning not being salvageable. We see similar trends when we look at trade-offs. So trade-offs people make or would make in the future, given simultaneous crises people face. The green ones are the ones people would want to hold on to: family, feeling safe, being mentally and emotionally healthy, sense of community, and therapeutic value of place. And the orange ones are letting go of, people willing to give up on things like culture and entertainment, restaurants and recreation. And under COVID, we have seen what that actually means. We also ask what people would find as an intolerable loss if they no longer had it. And many of the same things pop up, same things that people would want to hold on to, including feeling safe in a place and sense of community. So we need to understand these insights to better understand not only the priorities that come from the local level, but also to understand tipping points or thresholds or socially salient breaking points, such as loss of agency or locus of control, because these are the ones that are often embodied, unbearable, and dehumanizing. Yet we also know that these insights are often dismissed from adaptation programs, emergency planning, and models. And so we have a serious misunderstanding what harm people can live with and what breaks them. Of course, we also know that people take action, and here are the adaptation actions as laid out for the present and for the future, and what you see are the top 5 in purple. But you also see side effects in red, and in the present at least, many people think that their actions are insufficient. So it takes us very close to these breaking points and limits to adaptation. The ones I want to point out are mental and emotional health again, plants and animals around us. So even though people try to take care of their mental and emotional health, we also know that these actions can actually exacerbate tension. And here's a quote: "Talking about it, I feel temporarily better. I'm venting. I feel angry and depressed about government inaction. It can make you unpopular. People think that you're trying to be better than everyone else. You become a bore. The costs are kickback from family, tension, nagging, not being heard, being mocked, feeling angry, depressed." So we know they're out there, even in the future. And in the absence of more substantial adaptation programs, people refer back to, well, other ways, alternative ways of staying healthy, like doing yoga or meditating. And we have plants and animals and actions protecting bird life, pets, their gardens, but also those cost money and they cause emotional and mental strain. And one of the actions mentioned is people trying to consciously, I think in the future, detach themselves from the places they live in to protect their mental and emotional health. So what it does is, this points towards a looming mental health crisis. And we're not even at the epicenter of the Black Summer fires or the Perth Hills fires, but we see multiple attacks on people's sense of place in everyday life. and the realization that we will lose things. Now, what's important here too is the ability to anticipate over time. As Mark said yesterday, it makes it easier to grapple with potential or actual loss and allows us to explore what to let go of and what to insist on protecting. And here's another quote. After a community workshop that we did on likely climate futures, I needed counseling. I'm reframing things so I can take care of myself. Now, we of course know that these place-based adaptations don't exist in isolation from larger scales. And I want to make 5 points here. First of all is, we of course don't want to be parochial. We don't want to be too place specific. We need to be able to scale out and scale up from the personal sphere, as Lauren has told us. But we also need to be sensitive to these priorities and not be surprised when people refuse to follow, for example, top-down evacuation plans in the context of flooding. We know elderly people are particularly concerned about their agency and their dignity and don't want to evacuate. And we need to better integrate, as we've heard multiple times, these value priorities into sectoral or systemic adaptation planning and understand how what is valued actually differs across class and among particularly vulnerable populations. We include cult groups, homeless people, immigrants, indigenous populations, single mothers, frontline emergency workers, and so on. And I was absolutely delighted to hear this morning from the minister that Victoria will attempt to do just that, to incorporate place-based, values-driven approaches into key systems. And there are 2 more points I want to raise here, and I want to thank Karen Paiva Enrique, who was one of my fabulous PhD students, for pursuing this angle here. We need to understand how dominant pathways emerge and how they preserve the status quo. So when past decisions have become business as usual, and of course we can talk about coal, but also neoliberals' expectations of self-sufficient climate resilient citizens, when these become business as usual, they crowd out alternative pathways, especially those that focus on reducing pervasive inequalities and enhancing adaptive capacities. And that is problematic. And we also need to understand when and how the state becomes the biggest barrier, as talked about in day 1. And we have to pay attention to when the state is inactive, largely absent from community adaptation, and when it becomes hyperactive, particularly after extreme events, flooding and fires. When the government all of a sudden mobilizes certain narratives, usually those are not beneficial to those who struggle most. And we saw that just a couple of days ago with the fires in Cape Town. So we now talk about, the media talk about dangerous homeless people. What is not talked about is the forceful removal of homeless people from the city center over the past couple of weeks. And of course, understandably, people seek refuge then higher up in the mountain. So we can talk about homeless people and the need to have, for example, public buildings like libraries open to homeless people during heat waves because of air conditioning. We need to talk about what happens during energy poverty when people actually would have AC but don't want to turn it on because they can't afford it. Now, what is the way forward? We absolutely need inclusive, community-driven adaptation pathways that build on what we consider intolerable losses, priorities that come from the communities. And we need to think about those as nested trajectories across scales, institutional and spatial scales, but also across scales of mattering, who and what is allowed to live and who is considered expendable surplus. And we also want to consider different scales here, such as proximity, empathy, care, and responsibility, not only to the known others, but also distant and unknown others, human and non-human. And this is the justice and equity question that we need to grapple with in just transitions. So what that implies is understanding the joint vulnerability that ties us together, as Mark has said, but also understanding that we are not vulnerable in the same way, and we definitely do not have the same adaptive capacities. And hence we need to focus on reducing vulnerabilities to be able to enhance adaptive capacities. And my last point here, we need to make more space for deliberation, negotiation, contestation across scales. We need to understand where the blockages are and how to unblock them, what is fair, what is not fair, who the enablers are, whose voices and knowledges are missing, what trade-offs and potential pathways are acceptable and to whom and why, and which are not, and what futures are desirable and how to get there. And the ultimate question then is, how do we want to live in this world? And for that, I think we need to foreground not sectors, but entangled responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra. It's an excellent point for us to finish up on with those presentations. So please, in the audience, please keep those questions coming into the Q&A box. But I've been frantically scribbling notes during these sessions, as I suspected I would. And Petra, your sort of final point there, I think, serves us really well as a launching point into the discussion, because listening to the sequence of the presentations as we moved from Aboriginal knowledges and management of country and the possible expansion and translation of those across the continent through farming practices and the start of regenerative praxis there, through to more large scale, well, more, I guess, organisationally scaled considerations of infrastructure, with the consideration of infrastructure and planning. And then this crucial conversation around values, and where you left off with this question around contestation across scale. And I guess that's the question I want to put back to the panel, particularly coming from a point of view of engaging with the idea of values and those connections to place that was so brilliantly illustrated in the talks. How might we address contestation in values across scales? And I know, David, you talked about the need for collaborative approaches, but I was sort of burning to know how that actually pans out in a real way in terms of how Infrastructure Australia does engage, and how these questions of conflicting values across scales might actually be engaged with. So I might tap you first, David, to talk about that from the perspective of Infrastructure Australia, but then we can just have a bit of a rolling discussion from there.
Sure, that's a challenging one. So we're an advisor to government. So we essentially engage with our proponents, no matter where they are in the country and what sector they're working on, in terms of developing proposals. So we don't drive the activity so much ourselves, but we more provide guidance on what we feel proponents should be doing, and then obviously look for the good practices by proponents. And just to re-emphasize what I covered, it's a real shift to thinking about the role of the asset in the place in which it's located, and thinking more around the system and the network point of view, rather than just the values of the infrastructure in itself. We're driving that change through our documentation and through our education activities, but it will take time. There will requires a real behavioural shift in that type of thinking. And what we see is that individual agencies have a particular mandate, whether it's a transport agency or whether it's a water agency, and they have a particular mandate for their sector, and they're not necessarily thinking outside of their own sector. And we've documented that in some of our publications. A good example is the shift to electric vehicles and the impact that will have on the energy grid. So it's really important to contemplate the impacts of individual infrastructure decisions on wider networks.
Thank you. And I know it was a challenging one to throw out as the first one, so thank you for engaging with it. Petra, did you want to speak to that one as well?
Sure, happy to. So question, just to repeat, was how do we actually deal with contestation of values across different scales? And to start again from the community level, because this is the one I know best. So the first thing to me is to ensure that in our project, the 8 communities can be in conversation with each other. I think that's already an important step forward, because we realize more and more how isolating and disenfranchising loss and grief is. So to understand that grief can be enfranchising, meaning something that we share together, that we can talk about, that we can communicate about, is one step to get us closer towards this, I still think, quite nebulous concept of community resilience. It's often mentioned, but we rarely pick it apart to understand, well, what is in it? What drives it? And if we want to enhance resilience, we have to enhance adaptive capacities. And that in no way gets us around reducing inequalities. So I think the first step is to understand that these communities or local perspectives are not isolated. Contestation then across the spatial scale, or the spatial levels of the scale, is more difficult. What has shown to be productive is to work with mediators who can operate both at the community level and at the local government level, for example. And we have a couple of participants who fulfill this mediating role. They can speak from their own experience. And that has, I think, also in other case studies outside of Australia, proven to be the best way to make the step from the community level to the local government. We know that local governments, at least in our case here in Western Australia, would like to do more on climate change adaptation. Everybody's told to enhance resilience, but very few actually know how to do this. So there's an interest from local governments to see community-driven, iterative adaptation pathway planning. And once I think these pathways or these plans for pathways are available at the local government level, then there is an easier link to be made with state government. WA has a climate change policy now since 2020, so last year, November. It's okay. What is better, I think, is the UWA Climate and Health Inquiry Report that lays out how to actually work with disadvantaged communities, how to incorporate them into heat planning or heat disaster preparation. And I think there's some very useful lessons to be learned here, and I can expand on that, but let other people talk too.
Thank you. Joe or Scotty, did you want to respond to that question at this point?
I'll just add that, I mean, in my experience, when we're dealing with cross sectors, I mean, I think it's really important to be clear about what the question is that we're trying to solve at the outset. And from my experience working with Indigenous people, you know, particularly in remote settings where Indigenous people are speaking English as a second or third language, it's really important to sort of understand those realities that people are facing, and to ensure that, you know, communication and understanding is clear. And, you know, for those people who are living in more urban settings, I think it's really important to, as Petra spoke about, to ensure right across the spectrum, really, that there is support for leading brokers and people who have got some agency to be able to work across both diverse intra-Indigenous communities, but also with other sectoral interests. And, you know, those individuals, unfortunately, are pretty rare. So it's really important for, I think, governments and others to resource and support those brokering roles in coming up with solutions that are not just Indigenous centric, but a whole of community focused.
Yeah, and I'll just make one quick comment there.
Yep.
Like, yeah, in the rural industries, you know, there's a whole heap of different things going on, and probably ours is, yeah, we're very open and very communicative with other farmers in the area. We want them to be involved and come and ask questions, and yeah, just really sort of nut down what their goals and visions are for, you know, future generations, basically, and their landscape. And that's where, you know, I just love it when people come up and ask questions. And, you know, the drought was probably one of those times that it was very poignant, where that group mentoring and support was huge. And yeah, it was magnificent people to just ring and say, look, I don't want you to tell me what to do, but I just want to run ideas past you. And 9 times out of 10, if you ask them who's involved, who have you spoken to about this, and have you done the work and the groundwork to do that, you are probably making the correct decision. And yeah, look, yeah, anytime we want people to communicate, that is awesome. That's a true mentorship when that sort of system is starting to happen. And that's powerful stuff. That is really powerful. And yeah, that happens when people, you know, gain confidence in sharing ideas and support networks.
Oh, thanks. That's actually a really good segue to the other question that I had forming, which picks up on the point that you made during your talk around the importance of mentoring and peer networks. And again, I'll sort of put it back to you in the first instance, but I think this is probably one that a few people want to talk about, because that seemed to really resonate with the values that Petra was putting forward in terms of the things that people value and what they're prepared to give up and what they're not prepared to give up. And yeah, I was frantically trying to read the slide sideways with all the captions of the categories of things that people were willing to give up, which largely tended to be the more material things. Outside of, you know, it looked to me like the singular exception was the other species in this place. People weren't prepared to give up on those. So of the material things, the other life was the key thing that people weren't prepared to give up on. And so I wonder if there's something that's coming from both of those presentations around this broader interpretation of resilience, which is something more about well-being and, you know, the mental well-being of people and communities in place, including the well-being of country, whether talking in those ways helps us to think a bit more productively about the idea of resilience. So Scott, I'll sort of throw it back to you in the first instance.
Yeah, no problems. Like, and it's as we know, farmers are pretty proud people, and yeah, if I walked into the front door of onto a property and said you're doing it the wrong way, I know where I'd end up very quickly. So it is a totally it's an unusual approach that you have to take on that. But look, I think it's got to happen from within too. That's probably the big one I can say about that. I got a wonderful quote here from one of my mentors. It says, "The door of change can only be unlocked from cannot be unlocked from the outside. It can only be unlocked from within." And I think that's probably when people start to question and see what's actually going on. I think generally people are far more aware of what's happening in their landscape now. And I know during our dry time here, people were, were very aware of what was happening and getting fairly uncomfortable about it. And we actually had a group of discussions after we had a bit of a break, and they were specifically asked what went well, what didn't go so well, what are you going to do for the next event change that's going to happen, and write it in a drought policy or something like that. And I was amazed at the personalisation that actually happened in those discussions. That could not have come through unless we actually had done some groundwork to actually say, yeah, we're not doing anything scary, and building confidence of people to be able to do that. So a lot of that is that communication base, and that's a pretty powerful thing. We can't, regulation's a really hard one to even consider with some of this sort of stuff. But I think the communication, education and support and mentorship after that is critical.
Petra or any of the other panelists, do you want to speak on that one before we go to the Q&A that's come in from the audience?
Yes, thanks for raising this point, Louise. I think it is, at least to me, the most important one. How can we think about resilience through the lens of well-being? For me, this is fundamental. And you're right, things that people in our case study would be willing to give up or have already given up are really the more material things. And it was interesting for us because we saw the change over the last, well, 15 months or so. Before COVID, restaurants, coffee shops, and malls were still pretty high on what people valued. And many of them have become almost inconsequential. And people said, we have realized we could live without them. Of course, this is not to say that cafes matter in small, shrinking rural communities. They do, but the realization that people depend much more heavily than they would have thought and than we would have thought on plants and animals around them was the biggest surprise. And that, of course, is true for people in urban areas as well, or even more so because of the very, very short lockdown we have had compared to everybody else. Nonetheless, this has sunk in. And the therapeutic value that comes through birds and gardens and trees still out there is not to be underestimated. Now, I think the disconnect that is still there is when I look at WA climate policy, it of course has a priority theme that says resilient cities and regions. But it is beyond the imagination of policymakers and planners that to think about resilience in terms of well-being may be more important than thinking about, and no offense, Scott, in that with that argument, to think about resilient landscapes or drought-resistant crops, or to think beyond resilience in terms of what else can we do than implementing or installing green roofs or vertical gardens in urban areas. So I think personally, there will be so much more effort needed to think about resilience, not something that is imposed on residents or citizens, this expectation that we all have to be resilient and have to step out of bed in the morning as resilient. But really, this is something that we have to nurture and invest in and work through collectively, definitely not in isolation. So I think for me, this is certainly where the next 5 to 10 years ought to be spent. And I would hope that the National Resilience and Adaptation Strategy makes room for that.
Okay, thank you so much. And that's a very good segue to start going through the questions that have come up in the Q&A. So thank you to everyone who submitted them. Joe, there's a question for you that I think builds really well on this discussion around the valuing that people place on other species around them and people's, desire for those to survive and, resistance to letting those things go or be lost. So there's a question around whether there is a pathway towards implementing the Indigenous land and sea program in urban and peri-urban contexts and regions. So expanding it beyond its current locations more broadly across the continent, whether you see there's a pathway there for that to happen.
Yeah, I think it's very challenging in most urban and peri-urban contexts in Australia. But I point to the example here in Victoria, where the Victorian government has decided to negotiate agreements with Indigenous groups outside of native title. And I think after having been in native title processes for a long time, I think that in fact represents an opportunity to start engaging Indigenous people area and urban settings, and regardless of whether people have got large swathes of property or land in cities and so forth, should not negate for their ability to contribute to urban planning, urban upkeep in some of the more important areas that historically have also got very significant cultural significance for Indigenous people. So I think there are examples around Australia where those things can in fact be replicated regardless of whether people have got their own land and or sea estates. It can create a way in which Indigenous people can be involved in a whole range of processes.
Yeah, and I think that it's given the interest people have in retaining the health of the non-human around them, I think that that's a resource that can really be tapped into in terms of promulgating those practices so that Aboriginal knowledge holders can be deploying the troops of non-Aboriginal communities, if you like, based on that passion that people have got to see the non-human thriving around them as well.
Absolutely, and in most places where that is occurring, particularly in northern parts of the country, they are the only workforce, and so there's very little to no alternatives but to engage the services of those people who are either engaged as rangers or people who are a part of that program, and whether they identify as rangers or not is beside the point. But the fact is that Indigenous people have got connection regardless of the built environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a question, that was a question from Lena Lowy. There's one from Mark Stafford Smith that sort of builds on this in a related way. And he's said that between farmers and Indigenous people, both of whom we've heard from, the potential management of most of the Australian rural landmass is covered, with both often articulating their responsibility to look after the country, which includes its ability to be resilient to climate change. Is there a sufficient alliance between these players to push back against exploitative pressures from our current economic models? So that's to Scotty and Joe. I don't know who of you wants to speak to that one first. So whether there's enough alliance between farmers and Aboriginal communities to push back against exploitative land practices.
Yeah, look, I'd like to just quickly comment on that. I don't think there is. We very much value our Indigenous involvement in communication. You've got to remember, the Indigenous people manage this landscape for maybe 80, 90,000 years. And it's magnificent when you've only got to read a few books about what the place is like. And I think that's knowledge that we need to bring back in, definitely. And that communication and learning is critical, and we're actually at Mid-Lachlan looking to do a lot more of that style of thing because we think it's so important. That knowledge is vital to the way we manage our landscapes, and into the future. I think it's absolutely critical. So that's a lot more can be done, and I'd have no doubt about that. And hopefully we're looking into doing that. But that knowledge, that must be passed on, and we value it hugely.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that as well. I mean, I think historically, at least in my experience, there used to be a strong alliance with the National Farmers Federation, for example, when the Native Title Act was getting negotiated. Unfortunately, the polarisation of those political circumstances really sort of fractured that relationship. But I think there is, in fact, an opportunity to find a mechanism to sort of realign those two groups so they can come together. That is away from the sort of political nuances of Canberra and the decision makers at that level, but also that really empower those people who, in many parts of the country, are the managers of the national estate, whether they're Indigenous in terms of their exclusive native title or land ownings, or whether they're partialists holding partial leases and other forms of title. I think if those two players came together, I think there could be enormous gains to be had outside of processes of litigation and court-led processes.
Thank you. So I'm now going to roll two questions into one because I'm aware we are coming up towards time, and there's two questions that have come in that sort of both pick up on the community values issue. One from Eleanor Robson, wanting to know how you operationalise community values and priorities, especially when these pathways aren't often linear. And another which from Bob Webb, asking about engaging with community values, but flagging a risk that the voices are often those of community representatives or those who step forward, which may not reflect the values of the majority of citizens who are only inclined to engage when the disaster or issue is already directly affecting them. So are there thoughts on how adaptation and resilience institutions can dig deeper to ensure the broader community values are exposed and understood? So there's two questions there. One speaking generally to those approaches of foregrounding community values, but this second one talking about how you go beyond, I guess, the usual suspects who do engage to engage with the community at large. So I don't know who wants to jump in first on that one, possibly Petra or Joe.
Let me pick one, and maybe Joe wants to do the other one, and we can split evenly. I'll pick the one from Bob, whether or not we're working with the usual suspects. I think obviously it takes effort to ensure that we hear the other voices that often are not heard. It is much easier to do this in a research project that has a certain time frame, that has a certain number of communities that we have identified. So in that respect, we can ensure that we are as broad as possible. And we certainly find that it's much harder for people who, across our 8 communities, come from households or neighborhoods that we would call socioeconomically disadvantaged. It's much harder to get them involved, and it requires much more effort by far than to mobilize those folks who are already active in the more affluent neighborhoods in the Perth Hills, who are already environmentally and socially very well connected. So that requires effort. How to do that beyond the project scope is even more difficult. I would love to see a follow-up to what the National Resilience Task Force has done, and that's the report Mark has led, the Profiling Australia's Vulnerability Report, which does talk about values, but it doesn't provide a systematic inquiry into those. I think that's the next big step, and there's just no way around it. So Mark's team has laid out the parameters for how to elicit these values, why the differences in values and trade-offs are important. It has not given us a roadmap yet on how to do such a systematic inquiry or profile for Australia. I think it is absolutely needed. We're fully aware in our project that we only have a very few Aboriginal participants. We wished we had more. It was not conceived as a project that purposefully went after Aboriginal insights, values, knowledges, and we largely, hugely regret that we don't have more because we know what we're missing out on. So these are my two responses to Bob's question, and I hope they address your concern.
Before we wrap up, did anyone else want to speak to that question? It is quite a large one, and it's been flagged again in the Q&A about how we reshape policy-making processes so that people living in place are not simply consulted, but lead and shape policy in more meaningful ways. So talking about that tension between these place-based, very engaged and entangled approaches and the translation into broader scale policy. But we are unfortunately out of time, so I will just thank all of our panelists for their fantastic individual contributions and the conversation there, and thank you to everyone who has asked questions. Our next session is coming up at 2:30, which is why we need to wrap up now to give people a chance to have a break and stretch their legs and do all of those things. And you can see the link to that next session in the chat box. So again, thank you all so much for your contributions today, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation from 2:30. So thank you.